Hi guys, in this video we'll be talking about why America is so polarized. Now this video will have a slightly different format to most of my other videos. I'll be having a conversation with my American colleague who I met through a philosophy, politics and economics exchange program, and has worked with me on a political campaign during the 2018 midterm elections and at state level elections in the state of Virginia. Welcome to the channel.
Hello everybody.
I have to tell you, man, from where I am, things in the United States look absolutely crazy. People are talking about rigged elections. There's civil unrest. Trump has called for a third term. People can't even agree on wearing masks. How does it look for you in Washington, D.C.? And why do you think America is so polarized?
Yeah, things are pretty sticky. It's telling that the Democratic and Republican conventions this year were framed as a battle for our democracy itself. To both sides, the prospect of the other party winning is a catastrophic threat to the nation. I think there's a lot of lenses to look at this from, but I want to know what your take is.
Well, my take is that for decades you've had a neoliberal economic system that gives more and more to the rich and continues eroding the very few social programs that America does have. And this system stays in place because both parties are financed by a campaign finance system largely controlled by billionaires and special interests. And so when you've got both parties largely pursuing the same economic policy, what that leads to is a reaction. And that reaction on the left has been Bernie Sanders with what is actually a moderate social democratic program, but you guys think is socialism. And on the right, it's Trump with a protectionist, nationalist, anti-immigration program. And that's why America is polarizing.
Yeah, I think that does capture critical dimensions, but it's really more complicated than that. The distinction between Trump and Bernie misses the bigger point. In some ways, you can trace America's current problems to 1776.
1776? I think you're going a little too far back, man.
No. So from the start, our founding fathers had fundamentally different visions for what the country should look like. Basically, some of our founders, like Thomas Jefferson, imagined a country of independent yeoman farmers, strong property rights, and very limited national government, while others, such as the Hamiltonians, imagined a European-style, centralized federal government that could lead a national industrial economy. You can trace these fundamentally different views of government's role to our founding, which to us is still very important.
Well, I don't know about that. If you look at the polling, the majority of Americans want more government spending on social programs like we have in Europe. 74% don't want any cuts to Social Security. The majority oppose privatization. 60% of Americans believe it is the responsibility of the federal government to make sure that all Americans have healthcare coverage. You guys are living in the Wild West out there. No healthcare, no social benefits, no nothing. 68% of Americans support Medicare for all, even 52% of Republicans in one poll from 2018. The problem is that the Republican Party has been radicalized by billionaire donors like the Koch brothers, and Democrats keep meeting them in the middle. If you guys just had a better social safety net, people wouldn't be so angry.
Yeah, but even that's complicated. Remember, 35% of Americans still identify as conservatives versus 26% as liberals. We are a right-of-center country, and our Puritan roots are still very influential in our political thought. America has this idea of rugged individualism which stems from the Protestant work ethic, which was essentially the idea that you gain salvation from God through hard work. So Americans are very vulnerable to the bootstraps narrative. Polling shows that Americans have an aversion to the idea of giving people money who don't deserve it. An overwhelming majority of Americans support work requirements for most government assistance. Race is also an important dimension. The aversion is pronounced when recipients of aid are perceived to be part of an outgroup, like an ethnic minority. The progressives here talk about Denmark and Sweden quite a bit, but we don't have the same advantages as the Nordic states on that front. And by the late 70s, the welfare queen narrative, the idea that there was lazy people living off of welfare, stuck in the American consciousness.
Couldn't a lot of that be explained by the neoliberal rhetoric of Thatcher and Reagan?
Sure. Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, and Reagan-era rhetoric probably had a lot to do with it. But I think America's aversion to the welfare state is founded in a political theology that predates them. So both parties began to coalesce on economic issues, and like you said, adopted the neoliberal framework.
So what you're actually describing is a kind of depolarization. Because the parties united around economic issues, cultural problems began taking on a new significance. It became more important for politicians to attack identity and talk about things like gay marriage and abortion, things that really inflame people. And since both parties started agreeing on tax cuts, foreign wars, and neoliberal reforms, they kept stoking social divisions to win votes. And that's how you end up with Trump.
Yes, and no. Trump is our first president who actually breaks with that orthodoxy and is actually a response to that long-term consensus.
How so?
Well, he's clearly taken social issues far outside the bounds of normal discourse, and he's the first president in decades to be anti-free trade and support protectionism, among many other things. In fact, if you look at it, Bernie and Trump are on opposite ends of the spectrum. They at least nominally agree on a bunch of things. Anyone who's watched Tucker Carlson Tonight, one of America's most popular opinion news shows these past few years, can see the populist right realigning from small government, Tea Party rhetoric, to a sort of anti-elite economic nationalism.
So what you're describing is actually horseshoe theory, the idea that Bernie and Trump are two sides of the same coin because they both don't like foreign wars and are against outsourcing and free trade. But that's a false equivalency. Trump has given massive tax cuts to the rich, he tried to abolish Obamacare and has continued the policy of endless wars. Bernie Sanders actually wants what we see in Europe as a pretty normal social welfare state and wants to end those wars. One is a liar, and one actually wants things that will make America better. And so it's actually strange that more Trump voters don't support Bernie Sanders when his policies would directly and materially benefit them, because they think it's socialism.
One of the reasons Americans are more skeptical about social democratic programs has to do with history. The United States was the major Cold War power. Socialism is a dirty word to almost anyone older than the millennials. Also, the 1970s was the last time we had presidents who were really open to high social spending. Nixon, who was a Republican, was piloting UBI, picking up the baton from LBJ's War on Poverty and Great Society programs. But the 70s was also probably the worst decade in recent American memory. We had Watergate, the oil crisis, stagflation, and the Iran hostage crisis. It's remembered as a collective malaise. But the following economy under Reagan was booming. The American malaise was replaced by an American optimism perhaps not seen since mid-century, and that's still a big part of the collective American memory.
Yes, but the 80s was also the time of massive tax cuts to the rich, deregulation, gutting of the welfare state, the dawn of historic levels of inequality that we see today. The 1980s is when the top earners started capturing almost all new income growth.
Yes, but people still fetishize the 80s. It's the era of Schwarzenegger, consumerism, and
tear down this wall.
Popular culture today is basically an endless love letter to the 1980s and early 1990s. I think many people still like the neoliberal narrative because it's associated with good cultural memories.
But if you look at the rise of someone like Bernie Sanders, it seems that people are finally turning their backs on the neoliberal narrative. So why isn't he actually more popular?
Well, a lot of people do like Bernie. He's mostly viewed favorably, even if he's still net unfavorable among Republicans. There's a lot of talk about him being able to scrape off Trump voters, but the directionality isn't clear. 12% of Bernie primary voters ended up voting for Trump. One element of this is that elections often boil down to a referendum on the status quo, and both Trump and Bernie are change candidates. But another, probably more important dimension is identity. Ezra Klein puts it really well when he says the problem is that our social identities have become superimposed by our political identities. These things are becoming synonymous in America. America's always been very divided on cultural issues, but it wasn't until around Nixon and the Southern Strategy in 1968 that the parties began realigning themselves along those cultural issues. In the past, our parties didn't have party discipline. They were heterogeneous coalitions. Democrats had racist white Southerners along with liberals in the North. It was a real problem that the parties weren't differentiated enough. Now, we've more or less neatly sorted ourselves. Party is quite predictive of views on various issues. But being a Republican or Democrat in America today isn't just about what economic policies you believe in. It's about your cultural identity, how religious you are, where you live, what kind of car you drive, and your education. It's easier to understand why more working class white people don't vote for Democrats when you realize that Democrats and their voters represent a completely different tribe of people.
Okay, so people are culturally polarized. I get that, but the people who vote for Trump are still a minority. I mean, Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes. You just have a really bad first-past-the-post system.
You're absolutely correct. In the United States, small population states, which are much more rural, white, and conservative, are overrepresented at the national level because of our electoral system. For example, in the last midterm elections, which we worked on together, Democrats won 12 million more votes in the Senate races, but are still a minority in the Senate.
And it doesn't help that Republicans are gerrymandering and disenfranchising voters at the state level. And I explained this in my video on how Trump could rig the election, using tactics such as shutting down polling places in Democratic areas, voter purging, and now sabotaging the post office.
That is absolutely the most pernicious threat to American democracy today. But there's also a dimension we shouldn't neglect. From the right's perspective, and many right-of-center liberals, they have been losing the culture war for decades, and they argue that radical leftists have also done the same things.
Isn't this idea of cultural Marxism a paranoid right-wing talking point?
Mostly, but it shouldn't be written off entirely. 60% of professors identify as liberal or far left, under a third are moderates. Some polls show that 18% of professors in the social sciences are self-reported Marxists. This wasn't always the case, and the ideological gap between professors and students and the general population is only growing. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who's by no means a right-winger, has talked about how universities are being reshaped into activist, social justice institutions. In many elite schools and private universities, students aren't necessarily taught a messy truth, but prescribed a narrative that sorts people into oppressors and victims, one where we already know who the bad guys are. And kids from these places are funneled into our cultural institutions. Just recently, a moderate conservative New York Times journalist, Bari Weiss, resigned because she claims this sort of mentality has taken over the paper.
And so where does this leave the so-called normal Americans?
That's the problem. The average American can be described as a dispassionate observer and not really extreme at all. The data shows us that the most extreme people are actually the highly educated. Additionally, more partisan and politically engaged people do worse in predicting the demographics and views of the other side than less engaged Americans. And these people are running the country. The major trend in American political life today is a lack of trust in institutions. There are more independents than Democrats or Republicans, more Americans than ever are agnostic, fewer people go to church, the media landscape is fracturing, and fewer Americans than ever trust our elites. The frustration is that there seems to be many common sense solutions to our problems, which could be communicated to most Americans, but parties that tightly service our opposing cultural identities are getting in the way. Extremists have hijacked our discourse, and the most intolerant and inflexible people actually have the most bargaining power in setting agendas if everyone else is willing to budge.
But is it really to the same degree with both parties?
That may be the appeasing answer, but it's not empirically correct. Both parties have purified, but the electoral realities have made polarization vastly asymmetric. Democrats are still, and possibly increasingly in 2020, a big tent party. For my European friends, the Democrats are as if the mainstream Tories and Labour were in an uneasy coalition. The Republican Party, on the other hand, has become a radical minority rule party, representing a homogenizing, aging demographic, grasping onto privileged status as the country becomes more liberal, urban, and diverse. Economic dissatisfaction is a big dimension you brought up. The counties that voted for Trump were economically depressed, but research affirms that it was also, as Van Jones called it,
a white lash. This was a white lash against a changing country. It was a white lash against a black president in part. And
George Mason University professor Jack Goldstone and mathematical modeler Peter Turkin have predicted that the United States is on the brink of Civil War-level divisions, using models to predict state collapse in other countries. And if this election is a logistical mess, it could present the first time that power isn't peacefully transferred from one party to another in American history, or at least a situation where a large chunk of the population does not trust the election results. The tragedy of it all is that it's not clear if the system is broken. The American Madisonian system was founded on the assumption that individuals are power hungry. The institutions themselves are set up to be adversarial, full of friction. There is a sense in America that we have simply played out our roles in this institutional framework, but our institutions haven't served our own ends. Perhaps our system is playing out its own logic, and we don't like what we see.
So essentially, America is polarized because cultural issues have become so salient. Political identities have formed a tighter relationship with cultural identities, and the elites have become increasingly differentiated from the general public, and your electoral system is preventing the necessary reforms.
Yeah, so what do you think?
Well, it's complicated. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this video and you like this format and you want to see my colleague back on the channel, comment below and let me know. Also, check out his blog, link in the description, and thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.